This is Mission Control Houston, where we are live preparing for the installation of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft for the Northrop Grumman CRS-19 cargo resupply mission. Earlier this morning at 5:52 a.m. Eastern Time, NASA astronaut Woody Hoburg used the robotic arm on the space station to successfully capture the Cygnus spacecraft. Now, teams here in Mission Control Houston are going to work to install the spacecraft to the nadir or Earth-facing port of the Unity module. We are providing live coverage of Cygnus's installation. Thank you for joining us. This is Mission Control Houston. The International Space Station is flying just south of Madrid. This is a cargo spacecraft that originally launched at 8:31 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, August 1st, as part of a contracted commercial resupply mission that is delivering over 8,200 pounds of important experiments, hardware, and supplies to the crew living and working in space right now. After a successful spacecraft separation and orbital insertion, both solar arrays on the Cygnus spacecraft successfully deployed. The vehicle conducted a series of burns that brought it to the International Space Station. Once there at its capture point, NASA astronauts Woody Hoburg and Frank Rubio, who are currently on board the International Space Station, worked together to capture the Cygnus spacecraft using the space station's robotic arm. NASA astronaut Woody Hoburg was prime, with Frank Rubio backing him up for this. At the end of the robotic arm is the lead, the latching end effector, or the hand of the arm. Inside are latches and snares that grabbed onto a grappling target on the Cygnus spacecraft. That concluded our successful capture, and the crew were relieved for their duties for the day. Now the robotic arm is in the hands of the robotic officer here at NASA's Mission Control Center, who will maneuver it to its installation site. They will align it with the berthing port and guide it into its ready-to-latch position. After we have a successful installation of the spacecraft, which we are expecting in about an hour or so, the crew on board will perform leak checks. after which they are scheduled to open the hatch later this afternoon at around 1 p.m. Eastern Time or 12 noon Central Time. They will then start unloading the cargo, and those operations will continue throughout the week. Here in NASA Control, our robotics officer today is going to be Jason Seagram. He is working closely with all of our positions here in Mission Control Houston. Our flight director today is Fiona Turret. She was also on console for the capture of the Cygnus spacecraft. She is NASA's 100th flight director, part of the class of 2021. Her call sign is Mosaic. Her goal was always to work at NASA. She achieved a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis and came directly to work at NASA. She supported the final 2 years of the Space Shuttle program, also worked on the Gateway Lunar Outpost and the Human Landing System, that's the moon lander, prior to being selected as a flight director. She is on the bottom of your screen. Towards the top of your screen is the CAPCOM, or capsule communicator. That's Megan Harvey. She is the voice link between the crew and the flight control team. Megan was also on console to assist NASA astronauts Woody Hoburg and Frank Rubio during the capture of the Cygnus spacecraft. Two other positions here who are playing a key role: the visiting vehicle officer and ICE, or the integration systems engineer. They are responsible for monitoring the key systems and operations of this visiting vehicle, the Cygnus spacecraft, and will continue monitoring through its installment on the International Space Station. Right now, the robotic arm is moving, although it is very slowly, so it might be hard to discern on the screen, but you are looking at live views of the International Space Station, that robotic arm attached to the Cygnus spacecraft. You can see a view of one of its solar arrays there. Both solar arrays did successfully deploy during Cygnus's journey. We currently have an expected outage of our video as the station flies around the Earth. Those communication paths need to transfer between satellites. We are expected to get that back momentarily. In the meantime, we can replay a video for you of that capture of the Cygnus spacecraft. At this point in the capture, Cygnus was holding at a hold point less than 10 meters from the International Space Station. NASA astronaut Woody Hoburg was manually maneuvering that robotic arm onto that grapple fixture on the Cygnus spacecraft. The bottom pinwheel is where those snares actually latched into the spacecraft, and the horizontal bar at the top is what Woody was actually using as his target and his guide for bringing in that robotic arm. Capture went smoothly and successfully. That occurred slightly ahead of schedule at 5:52 a.m. Eastern Time, 4:52 a.m. Central Time. Cygnus is comprised of a couple different main elements. The service module provides power, propulsion, and navigation to the spacecraft, and then that pressurized cargo module is where all of our hardware, science, and experiments are located. As a part of that, over 8,200 pounds of cargo are very important research, science, and experiments for the crew. We have a video now that we will play for you with some highlights of that research. If you are just joining us, we are live from Mission Control in Houston, where teams are preparing for the installation of the Cygnus spacecraft for Northrop Grumman's CRS-19 cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station. Northrop Grumman is proud to name the NG-19 Cygnus spacecraft in remembrance and celebration of the life of NASA astronaut Dr. Laurel Clark. She was a NASA astronaut, medical doctor, United States Navy captain, and space shuttle mission specialist. Dr. Clark and the rest of the crew aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia tragically lost their lives on February 1st, 2003, when the shuttle did not survive re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. She is now delivering crucial research, science, hardware, and supplies to the crew currently living and working aboard the International Space Station. That is the crew of the Expedition 69. NASA Flight Director Fiona Turret is in charge of today's flight control room here in Houston. As in the Apollo era, she has the ultimate decision authority and is responsibility for the real-time crew safety, vehicle safety, and mission success. She is on the bottom of your screen. At the top of your screen is our capsule communicator today, or CAPCOM position. This is Megan Harvey. When you hear a voice from Mission Control up to the crew, that is likely going to be her today. Our robotics officer is Jason Seagram. He is taking control of the arm to conduct that final berthing to the station. Right now, the Cygnus spacecraft is still securely attached to that robotic arm. Those snares are still grasped around the grappling fixture that we showed you earlier. After he maneuvers it to the installation site, he will methodically align it, and then will come a series of latches and bolts to secure it to the common berthing mechanism on the nadir or Earth-facing port of the space station's Unity module. The Unity module is also known as Node 1. It was the first US-built component of the International Space Station. It currently connects the Russian and United States segments of the station and is where all of the crew eat their meals together. It was carried into orbit in 1998 on the first space shuttle mission dedicated to the assembly of the station. That was the mission STS-88, and it flew on the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Throughout today's coverage, you will have heard the installation of this Cygnus spacecraft referred to as berthing and not docking. That is because those are two different methods for connecting vehicles to the International Space Station. Here is a live view from that common berthing mechanism. This is what is actually going to install the spacecraft with the International Space Station and is a similar method to how the International Space Station was originally mated together. This opening is a lot wider than the docking interfaces. It can take larger payloads. After the spacecraft is installed and the team conducts successful leak checks, they are scheduled to open the hatch and start removing that cargo at around 1 p.m. Eastern Time today, or 12 p.m. Central Time. That final installation is on schedule, and we are currently targeting about 30 minutes from now. The robotic arm that was used to capture the Cygnus spacecraft is the Canadarm2, also known as the SSRMS, which stands for the Space Station Remote Manipulator System. This Canadarm2 is part of the Canadian Space Agency's contribution to the International Space Station. It is 57.7 feet long when fully extended and lends a helping hand to perform station maintenance. It can move supplies, equipment, and even astronauts during spacewalks. It can also, like today, perform those catches and grab visiting vehicles and berth them to the International Space Station. These are live views from the International Space Station. The station is currently flying over central China. This mission is Northrop Grumman's 8th contracted resupply mission for NASA under the Commercial Resupply Service, CRS, the second contract. This is their 19th total resupply mission. It was launched earlier this week on August 1st aboard an Antares rocket from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport's Pad 0A at NASA's Wallops Flight Facility on Wallops Island. That's part of the Virginia Barrier Islands. Teams here at Mission Control Houston have been working extremely closely with Northrop Grumman's Flight Control Room in Dulles, Virginia. NASA's commercial space program has enabled successful partnerships with American companies to resupply the International Space Station. Through this strategy, NASA is delivering on its goal of achieving safe, reliable, and cost effective access to and from the International Space Station, while also helping to build a strong American commercial space industry. Mission control teams had a tally-ho of the vehicle after 3 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. It conducted a series of burns that brought it to the International Space Station. And now you can see the Cygnus spacecraft being maneuvered by the robotics operator here in Mission Control Houston. He is lining it up with the common berthing mechanism on the nadir or Earth-facing port of the space station's Unity module. After it is successfully aligned, that's when the series of latches and bolts will then be engaged. We have 4 sets of 4 bolts for a total of 16 bolts that are going to securely install the Cygnus spacecraft to the space station. The robotics officer here in Mission Control Houston is maneuvering the Cygnus spacecraft using the space station's robotic arm. He is maneuvering it and aligning it on the station's common berthing mechanism. He is guiding it into that ready to latch position. Another view here live. This is the Cygnus spacecraft. We are heading into an orbital nighttime, so you will see that sun start to set on the spacecraft. This is a view from the common berthing mechanism looking straight out at the Cygnus spacecraft. We are currently in an orbital nighttime, which is why you see the dramatic lights followed by the darkness. Still some light shining on the Canadarm2. This is the robotic arm that has been used today to capture and now install the Cygnus spacecraft. It is also referred to as the SSRMS, that's the Space Station Remote Manipulator System. NASA astronaut Woody Hoburg controlled this robotic arm earlier to actually capture the spacecraft. NASA astronaut Frank Rubio was there to assist him. Frank Rubio also provided great communications here with the team in Mission Control Houston. The Cygnus spacecraft is being installed on the nadir, or Earth-facing port, of the Unity module. The installation is going well. We are waiting for confirmation on a good alignment. After that point, the robotics operator will begin to install a series of latches and bolts that will actually securely connect the Cygnus spacecraft to the space station. We are still about 20 minutes away from that actual installation happening. The space station is flying over, approaching Papua New Guinea. On board, the crew is going about their day. Coming up at the top of the hour, NASA astronauts Frank Rubio, Steve Bowen, and Woody Hoburg will enjoy a midday meal along with their fellow crew member, Emirati Space Agency astronaut Sultan Al Nayati. They will be back with Cygnus starting at around 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That is when the hatch is expected to actually be opened. Before that, the crew will conduct leak checks to make sure that the spacecraft is securely installed to the space station. You can see here some movements of the Cygnus spacecraft. You're looking at a live view from the common berthing mechanism. The robotic arm and the Cygnus spacecraft is under the command of the robotics controller today here in Mission Control Houston. NASA's Mission Control is staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to support the crew that is living and working aboard the orbiting laboratory. Here in Mission Control Houston, we are undergoing a shift handover. Flight Director Fiona Turret will be handing things over to Flight Director Chris Dobbins. Chris Dobbins is part of the Chris Dobbins is part of the class of 2022 NASA flight directors. He is NASA's 102nd flight director. His call sign is Ignis Flight. Chris Dobbins was inspired to pursue a career in spaceflight when he was a child after learning about the Apollo 13 mission and the work that flight engineers did in help saving the crew and returning them safely to Earth. Our Capcom so far for today for Cygnus's capture and the installation so far has been Megan Harvey. She will be handing things over to Scott Segati. The Cygnus spacecraft was developed by Northrop Grumman and is a part of NASA's Commercial Resupply Services program for the International Space Station. When it got close to the station, it utilized LIDAR. LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging. This is a laser sensor that pings off different reflectors on the International Space Station to give the vehicle high fidelity data on its distance, its rate of closure, and help to guide its final approach. This is a cargo resupply mission. There are no crew on board the spacecraft. We just heard from the mechanical systems officer here in Mission Control Houston that the teams are ready for the Cygnus spacecraft to be pushed into that common berthing mechanism following its successful alignment. Next, we are ready for those latches and bolts to be engaged. We are go for first stage capture. The robotics officer will now start driving the latches. We are currently in an orbital nighttime. This is a live view of the station's robotic arm, having successfully pushed in the Cygnus spacecraft into that common berthing mechanism. The robotics officer is working to drive the latches. That is only the first stage of our berthing. Our second stage is going to be when those bolts, all of those bolts, are secured. A correction that the robotic systems officer used the robotic arm to push the spacecraft into its final position there, but it is the mechanical systems officer who is currently driving those latches and will drive the bolts as well. We are still waiting for confirmation of those latches being successfully installed. After that, we have 4 sets of 4 bolts for a total of 16 bolts that need to be connected in order for the Cygnus spacecraft to be fully installed to the International Space Station. And a confirmation of that first stage capture complete from the mechanical systems officer. Now moving on to that second stage with the bolts. This is a live view from the common berthing mechanism looking at the Cygnus spacecraft. The Cygnus spacecraft is successfully latched to the station. It is now being bolted to the station to complete that installation. Bolting is still underway. We are currently in an orbital nighttime, but this is a live view of the Cygnus spacecraft for the Northrop Grumman CRS-19 cargo resupply mission, currently almost fully installed to the International Space Station. We are waiting for confirmation that all 16 bolts are in place. The spacecraft is being installed in the nadir or Earth-facing port of the station's Unity module. And confirmation at 8:28 a.m. Eastern Time, 7:28 a.m. Central Time. The Cygnus spacecraft has been successfully installed to the International Space Station. NASA astronauts Woody Hoburg and Frank Rubio were on tap today to capture the spacecraft using the station's robotic arm. After that, teams here in Mission Control took over to maneuver the spacecraft to its installation site, pushed it into the common berthing mechanism, and then engaged a series of latches and bolts to secure it to the International Space Station. The crew on board is going to conduct leak checks, and then they will open the hatch. The hatch opening is currently scheduled for 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Central Time. You are able to track the progress of Cygnus's important research that it delivered to space station along with Expedition 69 on blogs.nasa.gov/spacestation. With that, we will wrap our coverage here. Thank you for joining us. This is Mission Control Houston.